Hi everyone! In today's step-by-step tutorial, we're going to paint these bright and beautiful autumn leaves. These are so much fun to paint. We'll be using a lot of loose, expressive techniques, and the best part about painting these is they come in so many different shapes, sizes, and colors, so you can really have fun with your creativity and make your own unique paintings. Now this tutorial is a little bit longer than my usual ones because we're painting 6 different leaves, but I time-stamped everything below, so if you want to jump to a specific one or just watch 1 or 2 at a time, you're more than welcome to do that. So let's jump into the tutorial. I linked all of my specific brushes, paint colors, and paper below in the description box, so be sure to check that out to see exactly what I'll be using throughout the video. So as you can see, I sketched out these leaves already, but if you don't like sketching, you can totally freehand these if you want to, and I'll also show you how I sketched each one before we paint them. So just for your convenience, I actually printed this out so you can see it a little better, but when you do sketch them out, you want to make sure they're very light, so you can roll over it with a kneaded eraser if you'd like, because once you put paint down on top, you won't be able to erase any of those marks. So this is the first leaf we'll be painting. It's a pretty standard maple type of leaf. And this is, I would say, probably one of the more complicated sketches out of the 6. And what you're going to do is, I like to always start with this middle line. That kind of helps me keep on track. So I start with that middle line and then add a stem. And then you'll have 3 main sections, 1, 2, 3. And each section is going to have these little sharp, pointy edges to them. So I start at the top, you can do one side at a time, and I start drawing in these very sharp edges. So that's one section, and then I move to the next one. I have this gap in between them, and start adding more and more sharp points. They don't have to be perfect, they don't have to be symmetrical, but you do want to keep them in 3 separate sections. And then when you add in the veins, I have primary veins going to each section, and then each little pointy tip has a vein connecting to those primary ones. Alright, so I have my outline here, and for most of the projects, we're going to start by just wetting the surface of the leaf. So I'm taking clean water and a size 8 brush, and I'm just going to start by laying down a base layer of clean water. I don't want it to be super watery to where there's pools forming, but I do want enough water there so that when I go in and add paint, we can get some bleeding and blooming happening. So go ahead and add a very base layer of clean water. Now this first leaf, I want it to have a mix of yellow, orange, and red. And the yellow is definitely the lightest color of the 3, and I always like to work light to dark with watercolors. So I will start with my yellow. This is cadmium yellow deep. Again, all these colors are listed down below in the description box if you're curious, but I'm going to take a good amount of that and I'm going to start by tapping down some color, and you can see it expand out. That's because we already laid down that base layer of water. So I'm going to start tapping in more of this color. You don't have to add your color exactly where I'm putting it. The best part about painting these leaves, as I mentioned, is you can just get so creative. You can add color wherever you want, but I just usually like to have the yellow down here at the bottom. And then I'm going to start adding some of the tips. So I really want the yellow to focus in this bottom left area. You can see I have a good fine tip on the edge of my brush. And I'm going to gently, with a very dark pigment, tap that color in right around the corner. We're going to be doing a lot of wet on wet throughout this tutorial, so you can see I'm going back in and dropping in a little bit more pigment on there. And because that surface is wet, it bleeds and blooms on its own. So I'm going to leave that as is for now, rinsing off my brush, and I'm going to gently smooth out some of that yellow. One of my favorite parts about painting these leaves is having those blooming organic watercolor effects, so I don't ever want any harsh edges. So anytime I have edges like this, I take a clean brush and soften it out. Now while I have the yellow still on my brush, I'm going to add some up here on the top right side as well. Like I said, you can really add any of the colors anywhere on the leaf that you want, and it'll look beautiful. So there's not one specific way to do it. You don't have to put your color exactly where I'm putting it, but I'm dropping that in and then taking a clean brush and softening it out. And you can already see these really gorgeous bleeds starting to form that I absolutely love. Now I'm going to move to my orange. And to make this orange, I'm mixing Quin Sienna with Cadmium Yellow Deep, and you can play around with the ratios to either get a darker or lighter orange. And we're going to do the same thing. So I have some of my orange up here at the top, and I'm gently tapping that in, and my paper has stayed pretty wet on that base layer. I'm using 100% cotton paper, which I definitely recommend. And I'll do the same thing, using the tip of my brush to create the fine edges on the leaf, and then rinsing off my brush and softening some of that color out with clean water. Gently tapping it, helping it kind of move along that edge there. Again, feel free to tap these colors wherever you want. Just make sure to leave room for the red, because I want to have plenty of room to add red throughout this leaf. So leave some of the edges for that, but we're going to be doing this same technique, tapping in some of that color, and it doesn't just have to be along the edges. Like we have this yellow here, you can add some orange. You can add some of it up at the top or maybe over on the right side. But every time you add color, make sure you take a clean brush and kind of help blend that out into the rest of the leaf, because we really don't want to have any harsh edges once everything dries. Taking my brush, kind of smoothing it out here, helping that color blend out into the rest of the leaf, and look how gorgeous this is. We're just dropping in color, we're letting the water really do all the work for us. Because we wet it with that first base layer of water, everything blends pretty seamlessly. We can help it along, but we don't have to do too much work here. I'm going to add a touch more orange here, and then we can move on to the red. Let's add some up here on the left. And like I said with the sketch, it doesn't have to be perfect, because you can always go in and add more tips with your brush. So let's say, for example, if I want to add another tip here, it wasn't in my sketch, but I can go in, drop in some more paint, and there's another edge. So you have a lot of creative freedom here. That's why I don't want you to put too much stress on your sketch, because you can always make adjustments as you start to paint it. And finally, let's add some of this orange down here right at the bottom. Now, one of my favorite parts about painting leaves like this is having this very light value, almost like a highlight, throughout the leaf. So I do encourage you to maintain some of this light color. You don't want to fill and saturate the leaf with too much color as you go. If you do start to get that, you can use the lifting technique, which just means using a clean, dry brush and letting your bristles soak up excess. You can see it lifts that color right off the page to create a strong highlight. Now let's move on to our red. I'm using a mixture of Quin Sienna and Quin Lake. I do like to add a little of that lake color to really deepen it and add a touch of this purpley hue to the red. And what we might need to do, because we've taken so long already, is this part's already looking like it started to dry, and I want to be able to get those nice bleeds that we've been getting. So I'm going to re-wet it. Again, you don't want any water to be pooling on the surface, but you want enough moisture there to get those bleeds as soon as you drop the pigment down. I'm also going to add some red tips up here at the top, and also maybe one over here too. So all I'm doing is re-wetting it a little bit. And then I'll load up my brush with my bold red mixture. It's one of my favorite fall colors, and start to tap that in. And because we re-wet it, you can see the paint exploding out into the rest of that area. And this color just blends so well with the other two. So continue working your way around the leaf, and you're probably going to get sick of hearing me say this, but please feel free to add in whatever colors you want, wherever you want. There's not one specific way to paint these, but I just wanted to share some of the techniques that can then be applied to fall leaves of any kind. And again here, all I'm doing is using a clean brush to soften out some of these edges and clean up my lines and make them just a little bit more crisp. I also want to add some of that red color throughout the leaf, not just on the edges. So I'm going to add some moisture there and drop in some of that red down at the bottom. All I'm doing is tapping that color in. And you can see that if I left that as is, it would create some really harsh edges. So using my clean brush again, clean and damp, and using it to gently soften that out. Now what I also want to do is add some of these dark red tips to some of the other areas. So say for example these orange areas, I really want to keep the general area orange, but I want to add some bold red tips. So I'm using the very tip of my brush. I'm not re-wetting it because I don't want it to expand out too much, but I'm using controlled strokes to add a little bit of red to the very tippy top of some of these orange areas. Rinse off my brush, make sure you don't have too much water on there, and gently soften it out a bit. I'm not pulling out that color too much because I want it to stay up at the very tip. So softening that edge but not pulling that color in too much. So this project is really great for practicing your water control and your blending too, because we have 3 different colors here, but it's all blended really nicely and they're all working together really nicely. We have our reds, we have our yellows and our oranges, but it looks like one cohesive leaf. So now I'm going to move to my liner brush. This one is also linked below. I love to use it for details. And I'm loading it up with raw umber. I love to use this for the stem. And I'm going to gently start drawing in that stem. I'm barely applying any pressure down, and then it gets a little bit thicker down at the bottom. I'm keeping my lines nice and dainty and filling that in. Now, if you want it to blend a little bit more with the leaf, you can re-wet it right where it connects and kind of help that brown blend into the base of the leaf. So adding a little more of that brown, and then I'll do a second layer with an even darker value of raw umber. I'm keeping a light hand, not applying a whole lot of pressure, and by tapping in some of that darker value, it adds some nice texture to the stem. All right, so this is looking good. I'm going to let this dry before adding my veins. And you can still see some of those sketch marks there. I want my veins to be very crisp and clean, so I want to make sure this is completely dry, and then I'll go in with my liner brush to add in all those little details. So now it's nice and dry. I'm going back to my short liner brush, and I'm loading up some of this red-orange mixture. You can really have your veins as light or dark as you want. I'm going fairly dark, but I'm using a very light hand, and I have this short liner brush that is perfect for details like this, using the very tip of my brush because I don't want these veins to be super heavy-handed or to distract from the base layer underneath. I want them to just be very dainty, and I'm bringing that line all the way up to the top. So we'll start by adding these 3 primary veins. Let's do this one on the left. Using that very tip of the brush and connecting it down at the bottom. Let's add the 3rd and final primary vein, starting at that same spot and bringing it up to the top. I'm also going to add these fine little veins down at the bottom, carefully adding those in. And you can see it's a very subtle, this one might have been a little bit thicker than I would have liked, but it's a very subtle addition to this leaf. I don't want it to be this beautiful base layer and then heavy lines distracting from it. I just want it to be a complementary little detail step, but nothing that's taking away from those base colors. So now we can start adding all of the little veins coming from each sharp little tip. I'm using the same technique, and I'm going to work my way around this leaf, adding these in, point by point. Okay, so now that I've connected all of the sharp edges that we have, you can go ahead and add as many more little lines as you'd like. It's really up to your personal preference and style. You can keep it simple, or you can have a lot of them if you want. I just like to add a few more little subtle ones, even if they don't have anything to necessarily connect to. I never want to have too big of gaps anywhere in this painting. So I'm really happy with how that one turned out. Take your time adding your final details, adding the texture onto the stem and the veins, and then we can move on to the next one. Now our second leaf is going to have more of a curvy edge. The first one was very focused on the fine, sharp tips, but the second one has a little more of a curvy line. They're very easy to sketch. This is what it looks like. Again, I always recommend starting with that center line. You can give a curve to it and then adding your stem. The stems always get slightly bigger there at the bottom, and then it does not have to be symmetrical. You can see this one definitely is not, but I've added these wavy little lines. You can see some of them have more separation, like those. The ones up at the top are more of just a connected squiggly line. And then down at the bottom, I have more of a U shape here where the leaf connects with the stem. So just have fun with it, create whatever shape you want. The technique will still be the same. We'll do it step by step, but go ahead and sketch out your leaf however you want, and then we'll start painting. Now for this leaf, I want to use more of a green color palette. So between all of these projects, we're going to be switching between this red, orange, yellow palette versus more of a green one, but I'm also going to use some of the orange and yellow in the green. So we're going to be painting this leaf in two different chunks. So we'll start with this left side, or if you're left-handed, maybe start with the right side. But I'm going to paint everything on the left side of that center stem first, and then we'll paint everything on the right side. Once again, we're going to start by simply wetting the paper. I'm not wetting the entire leaf though, I'm just going to lay down this first layer on the left side of the stem. Make sure it's nice and even. Once you have that first layer of water down, we're going to be creating some highlights and shadows. We're not going to go too detailed, but I do want to add some highlights and shadows, and so I want to have most of my color right along that center vein and on the outer edges of this leaf. So the middle is going to be mostly light value or just water, and that'll help create a sense of highlight. So keep that in mind as you start to paint. Now I'm going to use my sap green, and I'm going to start up here at the top. I'm dropping in some of that sap green right along that center line. And because we were very intentional with where we put our water layer, you can see that green has that edge there. It's not going to be seeping over into the right side. So I'm going to start gently smoothing this color out using clean water and feathering it out. And I'll work my way all the way down to the bottom of the leaf. Again, I don't want this to be too detailed. I still want it to be loose style, but it can still be loose while also adding a little bit of shadows and highlights to it. So we have the center line done, and the rest of the pigment is going to be focused more on the outer edges. I want to leave that middle section pretty light. I'll start adding a little more of this green on the outer edges. And I'm kind of working between adding in color and using my clean brush to soften out any lines. If you want to stick to just green, you can absolutely do that. You can add in some yellow if you want. I'm going to add in some yellow here on the left side, and I'm using primary yellow for this one. I'll tap some of that in, and I'll also add a little bit of my orange here at the bottom. It's kind of matching up with where that yellow section ends. Once again, because we added that first layer of water, you get those really beautiful bleeds forming. I'll load up some more green and just start to accentuate some of these areas, still keeping in mind where I want the darkest pigment to be. But as it starts to dry, watercolor always dries a bit lighter, so sometimes it takes a few layers to really bring back that vibrancy. And I'm making sure to not cross over that center line because I want the left side to be distinct from the right side. Again, I like to work with all different colors just because it really gives it that color changing look that you get in the early fall time when the leaves are just starting to turn from green to red. You get a lot of different colors showing up there, and that's what I want to convey in these paintings. It's not a perfectly red leaf or a perfectly green leaf. It's kind of in that transitional period. And I'm also going to add some deep sap green to my sap green to make it even a little more bold in some areas. And I just love painting leaves like this because there's so much room to be expressive and creative and to use whatever colors you want and just have fun with the process. And before it dries, I'm using a clean dry brush or damp brush to smooth it out so you don't get any super hard edges. This is why I love the wet on wet technique, because it just creates such beautiful effects. And again, you can use the lifting technique that I mentioned in the last project. If you're getting too much color, use a clean dry brush and lift some of that pigment off the page. That'll help you create that nice highlight. Again, that's my favorite part of all these leaves, is these really light, translucent areas. It's such a nice watercolor effect. I never want my leaves to be too overly saturated with color. I never want them to get muddy, but you can go as detailed or as loose as you want. Sometimes it's easy to go overboard, adding in color and blending it out a million times. So I'm just going to do a little bit more here, and then we'll move on to the right side. All right, once it's had time to dry, we'll do the same thing on the right side. So I'm going to leave the tiniest amount of space between these two where the vein of the leaf will be, using the tip of my brush to create that, and then evenly applying water to the entire base layer. Same principles will apply as you start to do this. I want the majority of color to be on the outer edges of the petals and the inner edge right by that center vein. So that middle area, we're maintaining the light value. I do want to have a little bit of green up here at the top so it doesn't look like too stark of a difference between the left and right side, but I'll have it fade from green to orange. And if you're struggling with the blending part, or if you want your leaf to be a little bit more loose, you definitely don't have to worry about adding in the darker values on the inner and outer edges. You can do it more like we did in this first leaf, where we just kind of dropped in color on the whole base layer of the leaf. But I just wanted to show you some different ways that you can help your leaves look a little bit more realistic if you want to. So I'm adding in some of that color on this very inner edge, rinsing off my brush, and using clean water to smooth out any harsh edges. And you can see I like to start with this very light layer of everything, and then I go back in to add more color on top. I never want to add so much pigment right from the start that it looks a little too saturated or muddy. I really like having these light white areas, and then you can add additional layers with more pigment to bring back that vibrancy. So it's always easier to start light and then go darker. It's a lot harder to start with too much and then have to try to take away color. So I'm just continuing this process. I do want the majority of the leaf to be green, so I'm using mostly the sap green and deep sap green, but I have some touches of color as well. You can really have fun with it and make it your own. I always say this in all of my classes and tutorials, but I never want you to feel like you have to put paint in exactly the same areas that I'm putting them. If you want to follow along perfectly step by step, you can absolutely do that. You're always more than welcome to do that. But if you do want to start building up your own artistic confidence and be able to create stuff on your own eventually, then even just small things like choosing your own places to add certain colors, it can really help to start building up your confidence. Now I have that dark green on the bottom left, so I want that to continue into the bottom right as well, to make it look like it's not so separated in that middle vein. Each side kind of blends into each other. So now we can give this some time to dry, and then we'll go back in to add the stem and the veins. Now that it's nice and dry, we can add the stem. Similar to how we did on the first one, I'm going to take my raw umber using my liner brush and delicately adding in this stem. It gets a little whiter at the bottom. I'll rinse off my brush and kind of blend it up a little bit. I never want my stems to be one solid color. I like to have kind of a transition from light to dark, or you can always go back in with the dark value and just kind of tap in some texture. I love doing that for that branchy look. I never want it to be a full solid color. And now we can start adding the veins, and this will be a very simple process. Just like we did on the first leaf, I'm using my tiny little liner brush, and I'm going to use a very light hand to add in these details. I'm pulling towards the center vein with that dark green, so it matches that center vein really nicely. Pulling it down. I'm not going all the way up to the very edge on this one like we did on the last leaf. Just pulling it towards that center vein. And I'll do the same process all the way across the leaf. And that is our second leaf. I absolutely love this one. It's super cute. And now we can get started on the third leaf. The third one is pretty easy to sketch out. It has a lot of jaggedy edges, but if you don't want to sketch them all out, you can also add them with paint. So like I always say, I start with the center vein. I made my stem kind of curved, and then it's almost like an upside down heart shape. But I'm moving my pencil up on the sketch to create those very jaggedy edges. And these are going to be really fun to paint with that bold red color. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. Now I'll show you my test run on this. This is kind of the look that we're going for. Once again, we're going to work in sections just like we did for this second leaf, so that we have that center vein separating them, but we have this really beautiful shiny highlight. So once again, we're going to concentrate all of the pigment on the outer edges, like that, and then the inner edges along the vein. So let's start with this left side, or if you're lefty, start with the right side, and go ahead and put down your base layer of water. Same technique that we've been using, and that's the fun part of painting these leaves, is you're getting a lot of great repetition and practice with the same techniques, but the outcomes are all so different. I'm going to start with my orange. I'm just going to have a little bit of orange. The majority of this leaf will be that bold red, but I want a little of the orange up at the top, starting to gently add that in, and you can see I'm using the tip of my brush to create those sharp, jaggedy edges. The tip of the brush does the work for me, laying down that color and dropping in that orange. Same thing down the center vein, gently adding that in, leaving that center area white so that I can rinse off my brush and use a clean brush to blend it out. But I really like having that light, transparent sheen in the middle, so I don't want to drag too much color into it. But now we can move on to the red, which is my favorite. Again, if you want to use the same exact color mixture that I'm using, all those details are down in the description box. So same thing, using the tip of my brush to create those very sharp edges. And because there's already that base layer of water, you get the bleeds starting to form on their own. So I'm going to work section by section. I want to make sure I can blend everything nicely, so using my clean brush, pulling some of that color out, but not too much. And I actually want to make this even darker, so I'm going to load up some more pigment and go over it one more time. I still want this to be a loose painting. I want all of these leaves to be considered loose, so we don't want to add too many layers, so I try to get my desired effect within the first 1 or 2 layers. So continuing to blend stuff out, I'm rinsing off my brush. Every time you see my hand go out of the frame, I'm rinsing off my brush so that I can maintain this light area. If I didn't rinse off my brush as I did this, I would get so much pigment in my bristles that even when I tried to blend it out, it would be too muddy. So I'm going to go back down to my orange here for the very bottom. I'll add a little more pigment here, using the tip of my brush to create the jaggedy edges, rinsing off my brush and blending everything out. And that is looking good for the first layer. You can see the highlights, you can see the shadows. I'm just kind of touching up the top part a little bit. And that's looking really great. I am just going to add a little bit more of the red down here at the base. I want the base to be nice and bold. So adding a little more up there and maybe at the very, very top as well. And I'm going to add a little bit more of the Quinn Lake too, to give it that purple hue. Making things a little more bold, but you don't have to do this part. And as I blend everything out, I'm kind of pulling this color towards the center. That's the general shape we're going for. I'm not at the stage where I want to add veins yet, but as I blend, my brush strokes are following the direction that those veins will be. Okay, we can move on to the right side now, starting once again with the base layer of water. There's our base layer, and again, we want to start light to dark, so I always start with the orange before I go in with the red. It's always easier to work from light to dark, so starting off with that orange, adding a bit of that at the very top, just like we did on the left side. Pulling that orange down a little bit further on the right side to make sure it's not too symmetrical. And I'll use a clean brush to start smoothing it out, making sure to maintain that light middle area. That's why I'm rinsing off my brush quite a bit as I do this. I don't want it to be oversaturated. Now I'll switch over to the red and continue doing the same process that we've done so far, adding in the color on that center vein and the outer edges, and blending everything together. I'm going to speed up this part, but be sure to take your time as you do this. All right, so it's a lot of back and forth, but I'm going to finish blending this out. We'll call it good, and then we can add the stem and the veins. So now it has had some time to dry. I'm going back in with my raw umber, just like I've done with the other ones, and adding in my curvy little stem. Remember, like I said with the last one, you want to have some light values in your stem, some dark values, tap in some texture, but overall, these stems are pretty basic and simple. So now we can add the veins, just like we've done with the other ones. We're going to add a dainty vein for each of these sharp little tips. I'm using my liner brush, and I'm going to work my way, gently lining towards that center vein. And I'm actually going to darken that center vein here too, with my dark red, make it nice and bold, and that way you can see it better when you start adding in all of these connecting veins. Again, I'm keeping very light pressure as I do this, working my way all the way down. So go ahead and do it for all the little spiky edges. All right, and there is our third leaf. It's looking very beautiful, and our fourth one is going to be quite a bit different. So let's get to it. This will be the fourth one, starting with the sketch. As you can see, it's quite a bit different than what we've done so far. We'll start with the center stem. This is one of the easiest ones to sketch. You can give a little movement to it, and then all you're going to do is add these oval-shaped leaves to either side. And they're matching up, so the left and right ones are matching up at the same point. You can have some of them overlapping or underlapping, and then just pencil in these lines for the veins. And you can add as many or as few as you'd like. I'm going to work leaf by leaf, so I'll start by applying a base layer. You can see I have a little bit of that red left over from the last leaf, so I'll try to rinse that out and apply a thin layer. Now I'm going to go back to our green color palette. So we have some hints of yellow and orange, but it's primarily sap green. Don't worry on this one about creating perfect blends. We're just going to line the outer edge with some of that green, kind of soften it out, but I'm not worrying about making perfect blends. Just be loose with it. I'm going to go ahead and add some deep sap green as well to make it a little more vibrant. I'm going to primarily, like I said, be using my greens. Make sure we have soft bleeds. Make sure you maintain some of that light value so you have some highlight in each of these leaves. And then I'm also going to add a little hint of orange. So I'm going back to that first style where we just kind of drop in color, but we're not too worried about making everything perfectly blended or creating those highlights and shadows. We're just kind of dropping in color and smoothing things out. And I want each of these leaves to look slightly different. So have fun with it. Start with those base layers of clean water and then drop in your color. If you're following my color palette, you want to use primarily green, dropping that in along the edges, letting the water blend it out for me, but then just kind of softening those edges. So I want all these leaves to have the same color palette, but different arrangements of them all to keep it interesting. Every time I add a color, I rinse off my brush and gently soften it out. And when I say soften, all I'm doing is taking my clean, damp brush and kind of feathering out those edges so that I don't get harsh lines when they dry. So a lot of the same techniques we've used in the first three. For my green, again, I'm using the same green that I did for the second leaf, where the lighter color is sap green and then the darker one is deep sap green. And I'll probably end up doing 2 layers. I want this to have the same vibrancy as the second leaf, and this first layer is drying quite a bit lighter. So we're just setting the stage or blocking in these colors, but we'll probably have to go back in with that second layer to bring back the vibrancy. So I'm gonna drop back in some primary yellow on this third one, along with my green, letting it blend out, and I'm just filling in these oval shapes with our color palette, making sure to keep it nice and varied and interesting. I'm not making every leaf the exact same. So go ahead and repeat this process for all of the leaves in the first layer, and then we'll go in with a second layer to brighten things up a bit. Okay, so I have my first layer all done, and like I said, I want to kind of follow a similar vibe to this one where we have those really bright, vibrant oranges and yellows and greens. And our first layer, we were just blocking in those colors, but it looks pretty washed out or light after everything dried. So I'm gonna go back in with a second layer. It's gonna be a lot of what we just did, but really deepening those values. So for instance, the green faded quite a bit as it dried, so I'm going back over it with plenty of rich pigment straight from my palette and then gently softening it out again. So I still want to get those gentle bleeds, but I want slightly more vibrant, bold colors. I'll do the same thing with the orange. I'm dropping in these colors in the same places that I did in the first layer. We already blocked in those colors, but bringing it back to life with a second layer. Don't forget to blend it out as you go. Rinsing off that pigment so you can maintain clean bristles as you blend. And you can always use the lifting technique to lift any extra pigment. And you get those really beautiful blends of color, just like we did in the second one, between all 3 of these colors. So the second layer, all you're doing is making it more vibrant. You can see I pulled that color straight from the palette to get a very pigmented, vibrant shade. I'm lining the edges, rinsing off my brush, and smoothing it out. We're getting a lot of great practice with these techniques. It might feel repetitive, but that's how you start to build up your muscle memory and improve your skills. So go ahead and do the second layer if you want to. You don't have to do a second layer, but if you do, go ahead and take your time. Add in that second layer, make things more vibrant, smooth it all out, and then we'll meet back up to add the veins and the stem. Okay, so I have added my second layer. You can see that second layer really brought this leaf back to life. Again, you do not have to do additional layers if you don't want to. I just really wanted to have all of these leaves be in the same level of vibrancy, which can sometimes be lost when your first layer dries. Let's get started with the raw umber stem. It's the same one I've been using. And I'll take my fine liner brush and I'll start with the base of it. It has a little bit of a curve to it. It gets thicker at the very bottom. And then working my way between the leaves using a super light hand, making a very dainty stem behind all of these leaves and piecing it all together. So now we have the stem and we can start adding the veins just like we did on the second one. I keep referencing the second one because it's the same color palette and I really like how that deep sap green vein looks with that base layer. So that's what I'm going to use for these veins as well. It's deep sap green with a little bit of sap green. And I'm not going to go all the way up to the top for all of these veins. I'm using dainty light pressure and connecting them. They have a little bit of a curve to it. They're not perfectly straight, but I'm pulling all of these lines in towards the center stem. As I've said, you never want these veins or stems to take away from the beauty of the leaf. They're just an extra step of details that helps bring it to life, but you don't ever want them to be too distracting. You want the colors and the base layers to shine. And there you go! I absolutely love it. It looks so beautiful with the rest of the leaves. We have 2 left. This next one's going to be almost identical to the first one, but I'm only going to use 1 color. So you can choose any color you want. I'm going to do my warm orangey yellow, but if you want to make it green or yellow or red or blue or purple, whatever you want to do, it's up to you. As for the sketch, like I said, it's almost identical to the first one. I did make it slightly smaller, but you can use the same sketch as you did for the first one if you'd like. And I wanted to show you this so that you can see how we can paint the same project in just 1 color. If you're someone who doesn't want to worry about blending colors together, or if you just want to focus on 1 color for a specific project, we can absolutely do that. And before we start, just a quick note on value. The tonal value is the relative lightness or darkness of a color. For example, this outer edge is a dark value of Quin Sienna, and this inner light area is a lighter value. It's the same color, but the lighter area is more watered down, whereas the edge is more saturated or more pigmented. So that's what we're going to focus on for this leaf. We're only using 1 color mixture, which is that warm yellow-orange, but we're going to use different tonal values to bring it to life so that it's not just 1 flat color. So start with the base layer, just using clean water all the way across the entire leaf. And then once it's filled in with water, we can start tapping in the color. So very similar to what we did in the first project, starting by tapping in that pigment at the very bottom. Rinsing off my brush, we're going to be doing a lot of back and forth between rinsing off and blending and adding in the darker values. As I said, this is a dark value of my color because it's pulled straight from my palette. It's very pigmented and saturated. And then as I rinse it off and create these lighter areas, they're lighter values. So it's all the same color, but we're utilizing different values to make it a little more interesting. So now, just like we did in the first project, I'm using the tip of my brush to create the sharp points. So it's basically the same technique, but it's easier because we're not having to worry about blending the red with the orange or the yellow. We're just focusing on this 1 color and blending it out into the rest of the leaf. So every time I add color, I'm also rinsing off my brush and using clean water to soften it all out. Remember to maintain those light areas because that's what really gives these leaves the beautiful, delicate effect. Of course, if you do want to use more colors like we did in the first one, you absolutely can. I just wanted to show you how you can utilize values to just work with 1 color. So for the most part, as I do this, I'm tapping in the color on the pointy edges, but I'm also adding some areas within the leaf that have a darker value. That's the great part about working with a wet base layer is you can drop in color like that and it automatically starts to bleed and does all that work for you and creates these beautiful effects. I know I'm working a little bit quicker on this one just because it's pretty repetitive to what we did in the first project. But as I mentioned, it's the same process. Just be sure to take your time as you do this. So at this point, I'm going to leave it as is. We'll let it dry and we'll add the stem and the veins. Now that it's dry, let's go ahead and add the stem first using my raw umber. The stems basically are the same on all of these, but you can make them curvy. You can change the direction of some of them. This one's curvy, this one's a little more slanted. Just have fun with it. They're pretty simple and easy. Now for the veins, I'm going to use a dark orange. I don't want to use red because there's no red in the leaf, and I want to maintain the orangey effect. Red would be a little bit too jarring. So I'm going to mix up a nice orange color, and we'll do the same thing we did in this first one, with those 3 primary veins, and then the additional ones coming from each sharp little edge. And there we have it. So same technique as the first one, but just using one single color, and it turned out to be very beautiful. So you can kind of see the pattern here, and this last one is going to be back to our green color palette. I'll show you the example that I worked on here. This is what it's going to look like. It's a lot of the same technique we did in the first one, but using the green color palette. Let me show you really quick the sketch. This is what it will look like. You can start with that center line, and then it's a little bit more jaggedy like this one, but you can just kind of move your pencil as you go, creating jaggedy lines, pointy leaves, and then every so often give yourself a big gap like this here so that you have individual sections like this. So you can probably guess what the first step will be. It is applying that very base layer of water, just like we've done on all the projects. Now, since I want my green to be the focal point in this color palette, I'll start with that. I'm using sap green with a touch of deep sap green, and I'll start by applying that color to these very top sharp areas. So this will be, as I mentioned, similar to how we did this very first one, where we work kind of in sections. So for example, I'm adding the green here, but I'm just going to add it to this little top section, and then I'll move to a different area. Rinsing off my brush, smoothing some of this out, maintaining that light highlight. I'm going to darken some of these edges here. I always like the very tips to be the darkest value. So that's why lots of times you'll see me going back in and darkening those. And now let's move to the next section. I'll add some more of that green down here on the left. Feel free to add your green or whatever color you're working with wherever you want. You really can't go wrong with these projects because there's not one specific way that these leaves look, especially in the fall time when the colors are changing. Sometimes they're a lot more red, sometimes they're a lot more yellow. Here in Hawaii where I am, we don't really get much color changing on the leaves. But now I'm going to move over to this right area. So I'm working in chunks. I don't have an exact plan of where each color is going to be. I'm just feeling it out and making sure I have a good variety. Every time I add color, I'm making sure to rinse off my brush and smooth it all out. Moving on to my red, I'm letting the tip of my brush create those sharp edges for me and gently adding this color in. Red and green can sometimes be tricky to blend without it turning muddy, so make sure you give yourself plenty of room in between them and plenty of rinsing of your brush as you go. But look at that gorgeous bleed. That's all natural. I'm not even blending that out very much. But that base layer that we put in first really allowed that color to spread gently. And then we'll add some red up in the top right corner as well. I definitely don't want to go overboard with the red, but I'll add a little bit here up at the top right, and maybe a little more down at the bottom. Don't forget to also add color throughout the leaf, not just on the edges. It's all still wet, so you can tap in some more green if you want, or some yellow. Just have fun tapping in these colors and watching them interact and play with each other. So I'm adding the last little touches here. I'm not even doing too much blending because, like I said, that first layer of water is so nicely put down that it does a lot of the blending work for us. I'm going to leave this to dry and then we'll add the final details. Everything is looking so beautiful together. I absolutely love these fall colors, but let's go ahead and finish this last one. Going in with my raw umber, you know what's up next, adding this stem. I'm going to keep the stem pretty short and stubby, just having fun adding all these different types of stems to my leaves. It's getting a little bit thicker at the bottom. Nothing too difficult about them. Just kind of placing down that brown and then adding a little bit of texture on top with a darker value. So for this final leaf, I'm going to go with my deep sap green for the vein, bringing it all the way down and then pulling in these veins off of each of these sharp little edges. And you can add as many or as few of these veins as you want. Just work your way throughout. I usually do one from each pointy edge and then sometimes kind of offshooting from one another. And then if there's any big gaps like that, I just add a little dainty vein like that, but it's never anything that's too distracting from the main leaf. So I really hope you enjoyed following along with this tutorial. It was a fun little way to get into the autumn spirit. Even though it's currently almost 90 degrees here in Hawaii, we can still pretend it's a crisp fall day. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed the tutorial, and I will see you in the next one.